quiet. It was nice and it was nice and beautiful weather. In my opinion, I think the rain is beautiful, so I love the rain. I was so excited. It rained like all night and like half of yesterday. And I would have been even more excited if I didn't have all these holes in my roof from that huge windstorm we had. It was just like we had little buckets everywhere. It was kind of a mess. We had that like 80 to 100 mile an hour wind and literally like I want to say like 40, 50 kilos on. So I have some work to do before it rains next. I realized that yesterday over the weekend. So anyway, hopefully you all had a nice weekend, doing well, hanging in there. We're going to get back to this chapter. We have one like last thing with this, which was that documentary that I told you we were going to watch. A really interesting like series that was made. It's called the History of Sex. It was on the History Channel. And the one we're going to watch is about 20th century sexuality. We spent a lot of time like building up to now, kind of our sexuality now. And then this like kind of highlighting a few of the things from the documentary, but we're gonna watch that and then we'll move forward. You don't necessarily need to take notes, but definitely pay attention. And I think it's really interesting. You'll see the bicycle and the automobile and all the threats to sexuality that emerged in the 20th century sexuality. And then before I forget, I'm gonna hand this around. So remember, I'm not gonna take attendance anymore. I'm just gonna hand this out. So if you can initial or sign your name for today's date, it's not worth points, but it does help you keep track of it here. If you want your name to be something else, mark it on there and I'll change it for next week. That way it's whatever you prefer to go by. And if your name's not on there, then you're not enrolled. So make sure you come check with me after. I just printed that out this morning. So it's everyone who's enrolled as of today. Any like questions or thoughts or anything from last time before we get back into chapter 1 for today? And I have recorded this documentary. I'm going to post it on our Canvas site as we're watching it. So if you want to go back and reference it, or if somebody that you know isn't here, it is available for them to watch. But I do think it's a really interesting kind of summary of what happened in like the early 1900s to right about 2000. So they get up to the point of like the internet being created, which is a kind of a funny place to stop. Feels like a really long time ago, but it'll get us kind of to the point where that last slide we covered picked up from there. So it'll take us maybe, I want to say it's about 40 minutes or so. So definitely pay attention, stay with me. I am going to turn off the light so you can see it better. And I put the captions on too, so you have that if you want. Okay. This. Okay.
In the past. To be sure, intimate relations have forged our identities just as they have shaped the world in which we live. The impact of sex is immeasurable. Without sex, there would be no history.
That's really deep, right? Without sex, there would be no history, right? I think a really, really interesting documentary, like about some of the changes that we've gone through. And I wrote this up here. They kept saying prophylactic. If you were curious, that's Greek for an advanced guard. So like a condom, or like oftentimes it was washing, like men would go to these stations and literally almost like shower down or hose off as a way of like cleansing themselves after having sex. So I wrote that up here. And then obviously in the slide, we have some of the like bullets of the main things. But before we move on, what I want to do, I want to give you just like 2 to 3 minutes just to kind of chat about that with a couple of people around you. So find a couple of people around you, whatever's convenient, like 2, 3, 4 people. What was something interesting in there? Was there something you didn't know, or something that you kind of like are walking away with? I'll give you just a couple of minutes just to kind of think about it for a moment, and then we'll move on. So find a few people around you and just kind of chat about it for just a moment.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Right. Like parents. How much? I don't
So, hopefully you thought it was interesting. Anyone have anything that like you didn't know or was like super interesting to you that you want to share? You don't have to, but anything that like stood out to you? Yeah?
I did not know that Marilyn Monroe was a playboy.
Yeah.
I just thought that was.
Yeah. right, and she was totally unknown at the time, right? That's what launched her career, but yeah.
The two things I found weird is the whole thing around cow milking.
Yeah.
Why are they not? And then.
So obscene, right? Yeah.
Right. Connection. Anyway,
Yeah.
Jumping hoops.
Yes.
And then, speaking of jumping hoops, the whole opera thing of going into a bar and being like, I heard men talking about opera. I'm like,
Right.
oh, how scandalous.
So must be gay if he was talking about it now.
Right.
Naturally. Of course. I love that, right? And like, yeah, that just milking, like something that was obscene, right? Because the thoughts of sexuality, right? That,
But now
Was
they
our
use
connection.
to use it as like
yeah,
obscene.
right, right. And so it did kind of become something that was obscene
Yeah.
later on, interestingly, right? Anybody else? Anything else that's jumped out at you, stood out to you? Anyone know that condoms were made out of sheep intestines before now, right? It's pretty gross to think about, or it's come a long way since then, but yeah.
I just never gave much thought to how like revolutionary Viagra was.
Right.
And how important that was, I guess, to more sexual liberation, I suppose, right?
Yeah, isn't that funny? You don't tend to think of it as like some huge contributor.
No, it's just something
but it
like
was.
jokes, like, I don't know, like,
Right, it's more of a joke than anything, but it was such a like big piece of like something that changed sexuality for so many people. And I think most of the time when we're young, we don't tend to think about how that would have such a big impact. Yeah.
Your comment on Viagra actually reminded me, so I went to a ice cream shop like a few years ago.
Yeah.
And there was a bright blue ice cream that was called Viagra. And that sparked like my little sister like asking what you think, and like my parents answered honestly, but anyway, I just thought it was interesting that like how far it's come, you know, like, no one tried it, I don't know what it tastes like.
Yes, I'd be slightly afraid to try it. Right, like what am I getting myself into here? I love that. That's funny, right? Yeah, I think I would have fear to ask if there's anything about it. Yeah, yes.
Speaking of Viagra, it makes me think we still need to come so much further because of women and menopause and the problems that are not discussed.
Sure.
And the lack of libido and everything for women that hit a certain age, and that's still really kind of like swept under the rug in a way and not addressed, and people don't talk about it. But, you know, something needs to be, you know what I'm saying? Something
Sure.
needs to be discussed and recognized there, because if you're gonna do that for men, well, women should have that same opportunity. You know, because there is a difference when you hit a certain age as a woman when you're going through menopause.
Sure.
You don't have the same drive, you feel differently. And it can be debilitating in some ways and make you really feel less of a person,
Yeah.
you know, and it's just not discussed or.
Yeah, we do tend to focus more on like on the Viagra piece and the male impotence, and there's all these like equivalent versions of Viagra, right, that are out there. What's that? Forgetting what the new one is called. There was a new one. I had to look it up because I had never heard of it before. There was a commercial for it. What was it? Somebody. Whoa. I'm forgetting what it's called. They don't come back to me. But there's a lot more focus on like male sexuality. It's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, honestly, to add on to that, like in menopause and stuff.
Yeah.
I just think that women don't have it.
Yeah.
Which is really weird, like, there's just this
Let's try and keep it down so we
misconception,
can all hear.
there's like a misconception that like women just are not interested in sex, and so in,
Yeah.
like relationships and stuff, you know, when you're having sex with a woman, it's sort of like a task that she has to do, or whatever, like, and the man is like way more into it, and because it's like a stereotype, so.
Yeah.
I think the social perception really influences people not focusing on women's sexuality as much.
For sure. No, I think there's so much room for growth and research and more information on so many topics. Yeah.
Add on to both their points, it just makes you think about how much of the conversation in general focuses around men, whether it's in history or science.
Sure.
And how, for instance, when it comes to women's sexuality, it's still, the main part we talk about is babies, which is still the one thing that can also kind of, not the same amount affects women, but affect men in a very cisgendered sense. But no, yeah, I feel like we don't talk about, women's sexuality when it comes to menopause, and then also I feel like there is a tendency for people to act like women's sexuality is synonymous with asexuality, which is not. And I've actually heard that, which is bizarre.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we don't tend to talk about men being asexual
No.
nearly as often as like women being asexual. A lot of stereotypes, right? And misinformation, and the media plays a huge role in that. We talked a little bit about like, you know, the media and like the internet and everything last time. There was another hand there. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know, and this kind of sounds silly, but I didn't realize they discovered like the clitoris like that long ago. Because the way that people like talk about it now, it's like they still don't know where it is. They're always like,
I love that they call it like
For that.
Oh, yes, I've been there, right, I know where that is.
It's like 1969 is when they published it in like Playboy magazine.
Yeah.
Still don't know where it is. It's
Right.
kinda crazy. Y'all need to figure, oh no, literally.
Right, it's interesting because there's a lot of like, even now, like even all the way up to like the Joy of Sex manual that they talked about in Masters and Johnson's research. A lot of like, well, what did they say, the clitoris could be acknowledged but not dwelled upon, right? And a lot of women might care differently about that, right? So it's interesting, just the misinformation throughout. Yeah,
Also, I feel like it's interesting that it's not talked about in sex ed at all.
Yeah.
Pleasure is not mentioned at all.
Mhm.
As well as like masturbation is not really talked about. And then additionally, it's like a huge misconception that I've seen a lot is that it's like the clitoris is like one spot rather than like an entire organ that
Mhm.
goes around. So it's like, it's a weird double standard.
We need more information about the clitoris. That's the takeaway of today, right?
Now I know where
Right, yeah, it's really like, I don't know, there's so much that we know, but there's so much that we still don't know, right? And I think sex education is a really interesting one. We tend to focus a lot on like how to not get diseases, how to protect yourself against pregnancy, but there's not a lot of focus on like pleasure, right? And like how you can enjoy sex and have it be pleasurable safely. We focus on like the safety piece of it, yeah.
I mean, not that I want to, but I keep thinking of like my grandparents, I'm like.
I love that you said I don't want to, but
Well, I
there you
don't
go.
want to, but no, like
Sure.
where were they in all of this?
Mhm.
And, you know, like with my grandpa, like. A hoe when he was like in the army, like, like it was my grandma, I don't know, like, I just wonder.
Where's your grandma out there with pinups and?
Yeah, like,
You know, things you don't have to think about your grandparents, right? Right, was that a hand, yeah?
The whole bike thing was just weird to me, the whole bike thing.
The bicycle?
That bicycle, like, you couldn't, like, back then, you couldn't do it.
Uh-huh.
With women, you couldn't like lose your virginity at that.
Yeah,
Like, you couldn't do that on a bike, so, and nowadays you can just say, oh, here's a condom and let's just do it.
right. Yeah, the bicycle was a threat to sexuality is a funny one, right? Like
Right.
my 10 and 12-year-olds went riding bikes this weekend, and like in the back of my head, I was like, oh, it's a bicycle, right? You know, I'm like, look out. And like they didn't come back with a big smile on their face for any like awkward reason. They just run away, right? But at the time, like we had this idea that like if women just sat on a bike, they wouldn't want their husbands in, right? Wild to think, yeah.
Was that like something to do, because something that existed with like hysteria, so what they would do is
Sure.
they would like describe like an orgasm for a woman or whatever.
Yeah.
So was it to kind of do with that, were they like afraid women were like gonna start masturbating, like?
Just that it would be pleasurable and they would have found another outlet besides for my husband.
Bike riding, it could be so fun, right? Yeah. 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 Right.
They had to sit really unsafe if they ever were on a horse, they would sit like
Right,
inside.
sideways. Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's so weird.
Right, for the same idea of that it would be more than they could handle,
Yeah.
right? Just really like bizarre, interesting ideas that I think we don't get to like hear very often. So I love that they come up in this documentary because I think it's just such an interesting idea that we've come so far in some ways and we still have so far to go in other ways, right? And hopefully you found it interesting. I have one more little documentary that we'll watch about Kinsey. They mentioned him. We'll watch it next class, but it's much shorter. But it still kind of builds on the same ideas of people and their misconceptions of sexuality and like poor knowledge that we've really built on quite a bit over the years. And then we covered this last slide, so kind of getting through that first chapter. At that point, we're kind of done with chapter 1. So where we'll go from here is we'll start for just a few minutes on chapter 2, and then we'll get into it more next time. But what we'll look at in this chapter, I have kind of a cool activity that we're gonna do with this chapter that you can look forward to, or Greg will tell you more about it next time. But in this chapter, we're looking at like research related to sex. All right, so who are some of the big sex researchers? There's some big issues with sex research. I'm gonna have all of you do a little sex research. We'll talk about that more. Just as a starting point here, we have this picture of this researcher here with like the birds and the bees around her. Very common reference that we sometimes use when as a jumping off point for talking to kids about sexuality, right? So a metaphor that bees carry and deposit pollen into flowers, kind of like male fertilization, and birds lay eggs similar to like females having ovulation, kind of a very oversimplified idea. But if you've ever wondered where the birds and the bees, what that means, where it comes from, that's the origin of it. But what we'll look at here just a little bit, lots of theories. I'm not going to cover these theories. I'm actually going to have you read them on your own, just in the interest of time. But we have a lot of different theories related to sexuality. And I was saying this in my class before, my abnormal psych class that I teach before this, that psychology is all about theories, right? We have a theory for everything. There's all these different perspectives. They clash with each other. They overlap with each other. But they're really important for kind of setting the stage and viewing a phenomenon. So here we're viewing the phenomenon of sex. And we have these intellectual structures that we use sometimes to talk about what influences somebody's sexuality and their gender, their orientation, their awareness of everything around them, their relationships. And there's a bunch of these different theories, and I'd really love if you could look them over in your book. This might be something I test you on, but we don't cover. So they're in chapter 2, so make sure you look them over. But they've really played a big role in shaping kind of the different ways that we can view sexuality. And we'll be talking about them kind of all semester, so I don't feel I need to go into them too much now, but definitely look them over on your own if you have a little bit of a chance. Otherwise, what we're focused mainly on in this chapter is researching sex. Right, as we were just talking about, we have a long way to go. But someone who studies sexuality is called a sexologist. Right? That is a career. You can be a sex researcher or sexologist. And if you look at kind of the history of sex research, in the past, it was something that was mainly done by physicians, so by doctors, and mainly focused on the bizarre, dangerous, and unhealthy aspects of sexuality rather than what is normal or pleasurable or common. It's very problem-driven and fragmented. There is so much that we still don't know, and it's a very difficult area to get accurate and honest responses in. And a lot of issues with this type of research. Very heavily influenced by politics and the events of the time, right? So we're seeing that now, a lot of politics related to sexuality. You saw that throughout history, a lot of politics related to sexuality. And that can play a big role in influencing what's allowed to be studied and what we can know and what we can't know. So kind of over time, we have a lot of research about sex, a couple of very prominent people, but we also have a long way to go. So I want to mention these couple of people, and then next time what we'll do is we'll spend more time on these three kind of bigger influences. But there have been a lot of smaller contributions, and so I probably won't ask you about any of these folks, but just to mention their names, Freud, very famous psychologist. My second time talking about Freud today, right? But Freud is a very famous psychologist, very much studied sexuality. Everything for Freud related to sex and aggression. Right? Falling in love with your mother and hating your father, like all these hidden urges and libido. He was one of the kind of first big people to talk about studying sexuality. Yeah.
So is Freud considered a researcher even though everything is proven was basically false?
Yeah, so he did research. I don't know if I would call him, I don't know if I would comfortably say he was a good researcher, right? But I can say that he did do research. So his samples that he had were very biased, they were very skewed, and they were very small, and very heavily influenced by his own ideas and beliefs. But he still did the research, even if it wasn't good research. So, yeah, so I would say yes with that caveat. And I love that you're thinking about that, because there were a lot of issues with the data that he collected, his methods, and some of his beliefs are really kind of out there too. A few other people, a lot of these people kind of smaller contributions. Ewan Block was one of the first people to publish a journal related to sexuality. So it's called the Journal of Sexology, was one of his contributions.
Magnus Hirschfeld founded the first Institute for Sexology. All of these people being met with a lot of resistance. People would find their businesses burnt down or vandalized very frequently because it was controversial to study sexuality at the time. Richard von Krafft-Ebing wrote this book over here, Psychopathia Sexualis. It looks like it would be super interesting, very medical, very dry. It was like all these case studies of people from a medical perspective who struggled with sexuality, but still one of the first to kind of put those ideas out there. Havelock Ellis also wrote a book, The Studies of Sexuality. Clelia Mosher also played some small contributions on women's sexuality. So we have kind of some smaller contributors. And then the ones that we'll focus on more next time are kind of these three groups, which is Kinsey, Masters and Johnson, and Evelyn Hooker. And I'm not sure you could ask for a better like sex researcher name, but we have three kind of people or groups. And so what I want to leave you with today in our last few minutes, I want you to think about something for next class. Okay, you're not going to turn it in, but if you have thoughts, you jot them down so you don't forget. And so next class, after we cover some of this stuff, we're going to get into groups. And we're going to think about if you could study anything related to sexuality, what would you want to know? So kind of give it some thought in the back of your mind. You don't need to write it out, but think about it so that you're not trying to come up with all of that on your own right here. But think about it. If you were to conduct sex research, what would you want to know? Maybe come up with a couple of possible topics. What are some questions you might ask? And we will come back to that when I see you next class. So we'll pick up here next time. I'm going to stop there. If you didn't sign the little sign-in sheet, make sure you come up and do that. Or if your name wasn't on here, come check in with me. Otherwise, I'll see you on Wednesday. This.